Okay, can everyone hear me? Yep. Okay, good. Right, so last time we talked about the before and after of an excavation, and this week I want to discuss everything that happens on site and why that happens. Um, of course, you'll all know there's a lot more that happens on site than just troweling and finding things. And I can't cover everything in detail in just an hour and a little bit. But I want to start looking at how a site is unpicked, discuss the idea of a context, the critical significance of the relationships between elements of a site. So the layers, the structures, and all the other things that make up a site, and the importance of detail and cross-checking. So we always remember that it's a responsibility. We're taking a site apart, and our records and the quality of your digging doesn't just allow people working in post-excavation, after the excavation, to be able to envisage the site as you found it, but also to really understand and interpret it, and try and get to the bottom of its story. So the excavation process is actually more than that phrase, preservation by record. It's more than just capturing a site in writing and drawings and photographs. And as a consequence, what happens on site is fascinating and challenging. And the recording methods that we use are designed to be detailed and comprehensive and to have built-in fail-safes, but they're also intended to make you think when you're working on a site. So, for example, on the slide, you can see a field drawing here, which is a section from the Walltown Crags excavation through phases of wall collapse. And it's a detailed scale record of what that section looked like, the stones, the soils in that section, but it's also an interpretation of what happened. And that's a really important thing about site drawing. And on site, you'll do both plans, which are the bird's eye view, and these vertical sections. So there you can see section drawing underway at Walltown Crags, and planning underway on a site of mine in Oxfordshire. And then, of course, there are lots of other things that happen on site, like collecting samples, and we'll come back to those. And I think even if you're not planning to actually be on site and take part in any of the excavation and the things that happen on site, if you're interested in archaeology, you do need to understand how evidence has been gathered in order to be able to evaluate the stories and narratives and ideas that people generate off the back of that evidence. So that's part of what I'm trying to do tonight as well. Okay, so we'll be thinking about, amongst other things, what actually happens on site. What are the approaches to digging up a site? How do you go about exploring the various features on a site? And what are the stages of the digging process? Why archaeological stratigraphy is central to that digging, to the practice of excavation, and how we record sites. And you can see there on the slide a sort of typical classic open area research excavation where you've got quite a big area of land open. And then on the right, you can see almost the extreme opposite, which is a watching brief at Peel Gap. And that's where we're repairing, dismantling and then repairing a collapse on the wall. But an archaeologist is there to make sure that anything significant is recorded. And there you can see some original non-Clayton Roman fabric that slipped out of place as part of the collapse. Okay, an excavation is an exercise in project management. And from what we talked about in the last session, we've got to the point before the excavation where everything is in place. We've done our background research, we've got our research questions, we've got our permissions, and we're actually physically setting it up. And of course, there's a huge variety of physical infrastructure that goes with an excavation. You can see on the slide now, this is the infrastructure for a fairly big open area excavation as part of a community rooted project in a suburban area, a very neglected paddock. And you can see that there are toilets and a sort of place to keep paperwork and drawings. There's a little kitchen, somewhere to shelter, somewhere for the equipment. And before we got to that stage, we'd have had to clear the ground and open the trenches and put up fencing and tracking. And in this case, this may look very similar to what Corbridge looked like. We had to have a sump and a pump going over the full period of the excavation to keep that one open. But then, of course, you don't have so much infrastructure if you're doing something like Walltown Crags. There we had plastic bags and sheeting to keep stuff dry. We had sort of minimal fencing to protect the area we were working on, and we had our tools in boxes, and that was pretty much it. And oops, sorry. And then on the right, you can see how we got to work doing an excavation on an uninhabited island. That's the geophysics crew piling into a rib to go across to the island. And there, the infrastructure was a tent to protect the geophysics equipment, and that was it. So all sorts of things can be covered. And then when you come onto site, there are certain key elements that in a sense will always be there, whatever the excavation, whatever the size or location of the excavation. There'll be some form of shelter for valuable and more rain sensitive things, whether it's a big plastic box or in this case, a little site office just off the picture here. There'll be some sort of shelter most of the time for the workers, although not always. And there'll be perhaps an equipment store, toilets. For this excavation, we had an arrangement with the local council. There was a really nice set of toilet blocks associated with it's just near to the coast, with a beach, and we paid them a little fee and we were allowed to use that, and very nice and clean it was. You might need fencing, and then of course there are the trenches, and very importantly, the spoil heaps. This is one thing you do have to think of in advance. Where is all the stuff you dig out going to end up? In the case of this excavation, where it was very sandy and windy, we had to think carefully about the prevailing winds because we didn't want to be constantly downwind of a sand spoil heap. And you can see we've used the turf to create a little shelter for people and things as well. So that's the elements of a site. Now, the overall process is that you are trying to excavate in reverse order to that in which the layers of the site were created, collecting, recording, and considering the evidence as you go along to try and generate the best possible understanding of what happened in the past to create what you are dismantling. And I'm going to now look at a range of approaches to actually taking a trench to an area apart to digging. And there are a lot of strategies, a lot of ways of approaching a site once you've got it uncovered. And all excavations, as well as recording the details of any structures, of any ditches or pits, and layers, and all the things, the finds that come up, it's really important that you're gathering horizontal and vertical information on the relationships between all those elements, the layers, the pits, the deposits, the features, the bits of structures, because that is the essential framework for all the other information, the finds, the dating, the samples, your written record, your drawn record, your photographs. So it's really important. And I think when you're digging, to have that always in the back of your mind, how does that relate to how do these elements that I'm looking at relate to one another is really important. And then when you tackle a site, More smaller areas, narrower areas, deeper excavation is often a really good way of collecting vertical relationships, whereas a bigger open area gathers horizontal information. But what is often the case on archaeological sites is they are what is known as truncated, which means that over time, whether it's ploughing or later activity, has taken off the top of the site. So what you're getting is not the full depth of the original archaeological layers and deposits, but you've lost, I don't know, maybe 30 centimeters or whatever it is to the plough, or to stripping topsoil for potatoes, or to building, whatever it is. And you can see on the slide here, this is an Iron Age site with a huge number of intercutting pits, some of which had been used in their finally for burials, but it is quite truncated. We've lost nearly 1/2 meter of the tops of those pits, so that working out how they related to one another was really difficult, because you've lost the horizontal surface on which relationships can be established. And so it was where the pits intercut, so where one pit had been used and filled up and another had been cut in and taken some of that pit away, that was where we could get relationships, but the horizontal ones were otherwise missing because of, in this case, a combination of plough damage and topsoil stripping. But all the approaches I'm going to talk about are often compromises between gathering vertical and horizontal information. And almost all larger excavations use a combination of approaches according to the specific demands of the archaeology you're dealing with. And being flexible about your approach is key to excavating a site well. And indeed, most of the techniques I'm going to cover briefly in the next few slides are all used within area excavation. Okay, so I'll just use this site as an example of how you combine horizontal and vertical approaches. This is an early Anglo-Saxon hall, and these are the foundation trenches for the plank in trench construction of the hall. It's really difficult to see. Even in this lovely aerial shot, it's quite hard to see where the trenches for the walls of the building are. And that was partly because there is heavy truncation. Again, we've lost the top nearly 1/2 meter of that site, but also because there's a rising and falling water table in this particular spot, which has taken all the organic material out of the trenches, so that they are very similar now to the surrounding undisturbed subsoils. So what we did, if you look at the slide, you can see that we have cleaned down quite a little bit, and then we've taken it deeper over the wall trenches in order to get as clear a picture as we can of the plan of the building. And then we've gone down deep in these boxes to look at the profile of the wall trenches, because it was almost impossible to just dig out the fill of the ditches because of this complication of rising and falling water table and what that had done to the archaeology. So you can see here, that's looking across that site, and this is what you can see in the section, in the vertical profile of one of those boxes. And you can see here's the outline of the trench for the planks that built the building. The bottom is very unclear because all the shifting of water and iron salts has merged material at the bottom, and the material in has actually bellied as well and obscured the sides a little bit. So you can see there we're having to combine approaches. Right, so the creation of an archaeological site both during its use and after its abandonment, is complex because it's shaped by the existing landscape, the geology, the solid and drift geology, by the lie of the land, the topography, and the hydrology, the water courses. Then also natural processes have an effect: erosion, alluviation, so the depositing of silt, colluvium, which is the movement of material down slope, and other ways in which sediments are moved around by wind and water and worms and other burrowing animals, or bioturbation as we call it. And all those things can both add and remove layers. And there's a very good example of that when we were digging in that windblown sand in Orkney and other places, where the sand you see in a storm is lifted off some areas and then deposited in others. And that was a sort of quick time example of what happened over a longer period on sites. And so material can be added and taken away, and layers can be changed after they've been deposited by some of those natural processes. And those are called post-depositional processes. So they're things that happen to the site after it's been buried and abandoned. And worms, roots, burrows, chemical reactions and precipitations, for example, iron salts, rusting, and plain old decomposition can all have an effect on what the site, on the site. And then of course, people, both while it's being used and after it's been abandoned. People change archaeological sites and they remove parts of archaeological sites. So unpicking this is really complex. And now what's called stratigraphic excavation is the method we all use to help us think about what happened and to try and understand it as well as possible. And so that's excavating all the contexts, and I'll come back to that, in reverse order. Now, stratigraphy in the archaeological sense is a sequence of contexts, and contexts they represent an action. So a layer might be a buildup of rubbish deposits. A deposit might be a very clear dump of, say, metalworking material within that. The fill is what gets put in a pit or a ditch or a post hole, and a cut is an interesting one because it's an action. You're removing material from the ground to create a post hole or a ditch. It doesn't have a physical presence, but it has a shape. So what we're trying to do is to record all those contexts and to understand how they have formed. And the excavator is someone who is dissecting those contexts, recording them, and trying to understand how they're formed. So it's manual, it's thorough, but it's very thoughtful. It's what some archaeologists call interpretation at the trial point. You're digging, you're retrieving, you're recording, and you're reflecting. And there's a sort of sequence which you go through in a time and time again as an excavator on site. An area is opened and cleaned so that we can have a best look at what might be there. It's photographed and drawn. And then as an individual, you'll get a context, you'll get a unit of that archaeological stratigraphy to deal with. Maybe it's a pit that you've got to excavate. And you will get a number for the first fill of that pit, a unique number that is the label for that particular unit of stratigraphy or context. It's all it is, it's a label. And you have to photo it before you start digging, draw it before you start digging, and then start describing it on the written record. And we'll come back to that. And as you excavate, you should be continuing to think, perhaps to make notes and to record things. You'll be putting your bulk finds in a tray with that unique number for that particular thing that you're excavating with the tray, and I'll come back to those. You might be collecting samples, and you might be finding small finds, again, which I will come back to. And if you are digging a pit, you might have to draw half of a half section of it, and we'll come back to that. At the end, you have to finish your written record. You have to take a formal photograph. You have to make sure it looks absolutely beautiful to photograph it, and you have to draw it post-excavation. Then you double check everything and you start again. So that's the kind of process and sequence. It has a kind of rhythm to it. Okay, so here we are with some more area excavation. As I said, this is good for both horizontal and complex relationships, and indeed for picking up complete structures, like we saw with that early Anglo-Saxon hall. And it's almost invariably used along with that more contained, narrow excavation to create the vertical sections as well. And those can be sections that are in slots that you dig. They can be the trench side, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a moment. And before I explain the slide, let me just refer you to one master excavator, Martin Carver, who obsessed about keeping sites clean and tidy. I think you'll find that most archaeologists, however untidy we might be in our private lives, are very clean and meticulous on site, because it is true that the more tidy your site is, the less loose soil there is about, the straighter your edges are when you're cutting down into sections, the better chance you have of understanding. And so you can see Martin Carver getting really carried away. If any proper research is intended, there is no substitute for keeping everything permanently and ridiculously clean. So you've been warned. So it's tools, trenches, records, everything. But he also said tidiness comes before talk. There I disagree with him. I think talking, sharing experience, swapping notes, looking at other people's work and discussing it is really, really important when you're on site. Okay, so here you can see more area excavations where you've got pieces of buildings. This is part of a priory. There's actually here a little moat, and we've cut sections across it in order to look at the profile of the moat within the open area excavation. And here you've got that Iron Age site again, where we've cleared the whole thing, but then we're taking half of the pits out in the order in which in the reverse of the order in which they've been intercut. So we're combining vertical and horizontal. And here you see, again, in an area excavation, a deep section through a very deep midden in Orkney. So again, a combination of open area, horizontal, and deeper digging in order to look at vertical sections. Okay, so sometimes excavations run over several seasons, especially research and community ones. And here you're quite often thinking about maintaining a strategic section. So an important vertical section across an area. This is a Viking longhouse. We're looking at 2/3 of it. Here are the walls running round. This is the entrance, paved entrance passageway. Here's the entrance into this, which is the domestic end of the longhouse. This is the cooking end. There would have been wooden platforms here and benches along here. And these are the remains of hearths that have been built in the centre of the longhouse. And we have dug down by this point well over 2 meters. But as we went down, you can see here, we would have that little balk, that little line running across the centre of the longhouse. And as we go down, we're actually recording, drawing each the section as we go down. But then because it's in sand and it's quite vulnerable, we're taking it down, but we're adding on each time, we're adding on another bit of the drawing. So that's called a running section, where you record it and take it down, then record the next bit and take it down again. So you can combine it with open area excavation. And here's a kind of a much more contained example of a very targeted trench. where we're looking. Obviously this is a really interesting vertical section of the wall, but in order to get a section looking at all these phases of collapse, we've gone down in what's often called a sondage, which is a deep, small look-see down into the archaeology. And here's another little sondage in the corner of a trench where it's really looking to see how deep the deposits are. And this has reached the undisturbed sandy subsoil here, and gives us a sort of handle on the sort of depth that you're dealing with. And that'd be really helpful when you're planning how much you can actually get done in a season. And here is one of those pits, half section, those Iron Age pits. And this is actually 2 intercutting pits. And this is the latest one of the pair. And so that's been dug out first. And we've taken out half of it. So you can still see the shape of the pit here, its plan. But we've also got a really nice look at its fills. And I think you can see that there's something different here than there is in this part of it. And if you look here, this is the fill of the earlier pit, and that part of it has been cut out by the later pit. So you're catching a relationship as well. And this was the running section that I was talking about through the Viking longhouse. Other approaches, if you've got a big sort of heterogeneous feature like a midden, which can be really, really hard to disentangle, thrown bucket load of slop spy, thrown bucket load of fish scales, whatever it is. And so to sample its character and to get some sections through it, some looks, vertical looks at it, you can do this kind of thing where you're not digging the whole thing, but you're sampling from the whole area of what is in it and what you're getting from it, and for analysis, but you're also getting all these little sections through it. This is a sort of similar approach. This is a Bronze Age mound, and in the old days, with anything that might have been a burial mound, what happened was you went to the center and you just dug down looking for whatever might be buried in the center. Now most usually do something called quadranting and take out a quarter, and then you've got these vertical sections through it, and you've got the plan of what the mound looks like. And this one, they've actually established, you can see a grid over the mound, and that they will have been using that to assign finds and samples to a much more contained area within one big context, this big stony context. So they've got some idea of parts of the mound from which finds might come. And here you can see a similar approach to a really big, huge, big pit, which has had one quadrant taken out already, and they've started on a second one. And what that will do, again, it'll give you the finds from inside half of the pit. It'll give you the shape of it. It'll give you a look at the fills. But also by doing 2 quarters like that, you'll get a section right through the center of it as well. And then this approach on that uninhabited island, the eroded Viking structure, is called tapestry excavation, and it's where you're excavating vertically. Instead of working across horizontally, you're actually taking shaving downwards and taking a bit off the front in order to record a section. Okay, and finally, there was that the program about test pitting in people's back gardens. This is a test pit in a back garden underway in another project. And it's a way, test pits are brilliant because they're a fabulous way. Sometimes you find extraordinary things, but they're a way of sampling what's going on. You get the pottery, you get other finds, you get a look at the deposits. And if you have enough of them scattered around an area, you get a really good sense of what's going on in particularly villages or suburban areas. These long, thin trenches that commercial excavations do, called evaluation trenches, are ones that are literally about just seeing what the survival of the archaeology is like before suggesting what happens next. And here you can see narrow slots within larger excavations used to explore, again, depth and vertical relationships. And finally, here you can see a very complicated Iron Age site with a number of drainage ditches and ditches for enclosures. You can see on this very difficult to understand plan. And again, that was one where, because you've got very hard to distinguish, it's very hard to distinguish the subsoils into which ditches and pits and post holes are cut from their fills. You're working with both area excavation and doing these box sections where, instead of just digging out the fill of the ditch, you're over digging it so you can see the profile as clearly as possible. You can just about see the profile of one of the ditches there. And just take note of this. This is one of those wonderful Iron Age storage pits, and we're going to come back to this. So just have a look at how it looks and imagine trying to photograph that. Okay, so all those different approaches to how you dig a site, as I say, are ones that you're likely to use in combination, and it's very difficult to predict ahead of time what you're going to do exactly, because you don't know what the archaeology is going to be like. But you're always thinking, okay, how am I going to approach that? How am I going to unpick and understand that? And of course, it's very important to know exactly where things are within the trench. And location is very, very important. And sometimes the details don't, those can escape. And it's actually surprisingly easy to lose the precise location of pits if you're not careful about how you're recording things. So sometimes all the locational recording is done by a total station, so an electronic instrument, or by a survey grade GPS, or sometimes each of the open trenches will have its own mini equivalent of the Ordnance Survey national grid set up, but it won't be with the big long numbers we use in Ordnance Survey. It will be using nice straightforward numbers, but then the system works exactly the same as reading a map reference. So you have an arbitrarily established point outside of your trench. There's a 0, somewhere off the slide, and all the site grid measurements are taken from that point. And here you can see, here's the trench, inside its grid, and it'll have a selection of little pegs along the side of the trench marking where the grid points are, and you're then able to measure where everything within the trench is. So if you've got a gold coin, you find here, you can locate it because it's at 14 meters east. You always do the easterlies first, just like in Ordnance Survey readings, and 18 meters north. And so immediately, you know where that is. But the point of this slide really is just to say, just remember that location is really important. Now, let's go back to the physical things that you're extracting and keeping from a site. Here we've got what are known as bulk finds. And they are the things that you find within the layer, the context, the soil that you're digging, the pit, the post hole, the ditch, that are collected without any more precise spatial data. So they're not located precisely within the area that you're digging. And that can include, as you can see in this tray, bone, pottery, tile, or what's known as ceramic building material is the catch-all. In this case, the nuns of the priory that we were excavating there were eating a lot of oysters. And you can see that there's a little tag with the tray, which gives the trench number. It gives the context number, so the number that labels your soil. Sometimes metal artifacts, metal bits are part of bulk finds. On other sites, they might be more special finds, and I'll talk about small finds in a minute. On the right, you can see the front page of a filled-in written record sheet for a context, and you can see there's a lot of information on there. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about those, but I'm not going to have time tonight to talk about the detail. And that's something I hope we'll be able to do trench side talks on. But you can see on this form at the bottom here, it says bulk finds, and it gives a detail of the finds that were collected. It's not actually this tray, and the sort of proportion of finds there are in the context and the sort of condition that they're in. And here is a small find. Now, small finds can be huge. They can be a quernstone, they can be a tiny little Bronze Age barbed and tanged arrowhead like this one. But the point about them is they're particularly diagnostic, they're particularly helpful in some way, they're particularly valuable or particularly unusual. Silver and gold artifacts, evidence for metalworking, coins, other metal artifacts, worked bone, worked stone, worked flint. And for example, you might record all the hobnails you find on a Roman site, although I have to say that you can regret that, because when you're recording every hobnail as a small find and it's a very rich site, that can get a bit out of hand. So you have to think a bit about what you're recording in this way, because these small finds, these special diagnostic finds, have a whole separate numbering system, their own number, which goes down here in a triangle, and they have their own separate recording system and are dealt with in a slightly different way, because you have to locate them precisely in space. So not just with their site grid reference, but also with their height above sea level. So you also take environmental samples as you're digging. You can see the digger here has got those big white buckets, and she is collecting a general environmental sample to be taken away to, we talked about the post-ex, where these big soil samples are taken and put through a system of sieves with running water to get charred grain and seed and tiny little bones and other very small environmental bits of data out of the soil. And you just literally put all the soil without taking things out into the bucket, and that's taken away to be analysed. But of course, you need to record that you've done that fact. So there's a place for you to give it, to record that you've done it. It has a separate recording system. There's more paperwork and another number that goes in a diamond. You might take smaller soil samples like these ones for separate analysis, and they're recorded down here. And there will be different sampling strategies on every site. Okay, and then there's also the written record, and I'll talk about a context sheet in a moment, but there's also quite often the supervisor or the director of an excavation will keep a running notebook recording their decisions and thoughts and actions. Quite a few diggers will do that too, as well as the formal record, and those can be immensely helpful because they chart the changes in your ideas and thoughts about a site. And there's also the photographic record, and there's a whole range of different photographs that get taken on site, and they work together with the drawn record. So you get things called working shots. This is definitely a pre-COVID site that's beginning to clean up a new trench. This is a pre-excavation shot, so you can see that there's some sort of ditch here, and the end of a ditch here, and the edge of a pit here, but they've been exposed and shown below the plough soil, but they haven't been excavated. And that's a formal shot with a scale and a north arrow. And here is an aerial shot of the same area after excavation. It's on slightly different orientation, but this ditch here has had some slots put across it. The pit has been excavated, half section. There's the vertical section. That little ditch end has been explored, as have these root holes. And that's a post-excavation shot. That's done with a boom. And then you also, I like to do end of day shots. So you do a quick shot round, walk around the trench and take record shots of what it looks like at the end of each day, because again, that helps chart our progress. And then there's the core of the written record, which is the context sheet. So this is the sheet that records all the details about that unit of stratigraphy, that layer, that rubbish layer, that metalworking deposit, that cut for a post hole, that fill of a pit, which represents an action in the past. This is where all the details about that context go. And there are all sorts of basic information that go at the top of the sheet. There are, the records of the finds and the small finds and the sampling. And here in the middle, you've got prompts to help you describe the soils according to a sort of formula. But there's also space for describing it, what it looks like in relation to other things, and to give a sort of overall description, and also for you to try and suggest what might have happened in the past in order to produce the thing that you're describing. So it's about location and description and measurements and comparison and comment. And it's absolutely vital part of being on site. And then the back is for doing a little drawing and putting any more information you want. And drawings are really helpful because they can be annotated. And here you can see another filled in one with all the details there and a little sketch on the back of where the context actually is. And you can see here it is. And here it's in relation to other deposits. This is a wall. And as I say, we haven't got time to go into the detail of this now, but I'm hoping we'll get plenty of chance to do this when we're looking at soil and structures and features in front of us. Okay, then finally there's this the drawn record, and there are two sorts of drawings. There are plans, which is a bird's eye view, and sections, which are recording all those vertical cuts through layers, which you have worked hard to establish as you've been digging. On the backs of the context sheets, you'll quite often do drawings of just the context that you're working on. But quite a lot of the plans that are done to scale, like this one you can see in front of you, which is a scale drawing of those pits that I was showing you earlier. Often they include several contexts, and quite often they'll be of one phase of activity, but sometimes they'll include a number of phases, and they'll be picked out in different colours in order to show how things relate to one another. And they're very good for showing horizontal relationships and showing full features, and they should be read in conjunction with sections. And here you can see some diggers planning using a 1 meter square planning frame, and me doing the same up there. And this, you can see that I just gave you that to show you this is what this plan is depicting. And partly also to say, think about how a photograph can capture a certain aspect, but what the plan does is allow you to interpret it and capture other aspects. So the two work together. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And here you can see there are various, as with the context sheets, there are various things that you follow, various ways of depicting things when you draw on site, and there's always a book on site to show you how to do that. Different sites have different conventions, but as long as they're consistent, that doesn't matter. And its sections, of course, are really important for understanding the relationships that underpin our interpretations of the site. And you remember that photograph I showed you of the big Iron Age storage pit? Impossible to photograph the section of that. It was too deep and too much in shadow. So the scale drawing is essential, and that's the scale drawing of the cut through that pit, which gives you far more information to add into the photograph. And here you can see people busy section drawing in that little set of pits there. And here's a lovely section drawing of the foundations of a little chapel, and you can see that this has really interpreted the foundations, because these dark lines are showing different phases of building, and so you can see that there have been changes and alterations to the building. And this is just a little slide that shows you how you do a section drawing, where you put a level line across it and you're measuring up and down in order to create a scale picture of in this case, an Iron Age pit kiln, which is just lovely colours. As partly, I like this slide just because it's so pretty. Okay, I'm going to stop now because Ian's going to chip in for a little bit, and then I'm just going to finish up with a few minutes to talk about ways in which we try and understand archaeological stratigraphy to set us up for our discussion in a couple of weeks' time. So over to you, Ian.
Great, thanks, Jane. In the last talk, I gave you some headline reasons about the way that, can everybody hear me, by the way? Just got a message up saying my internet's unstable. Okay, right, good. If there's any problems, if you can give me a wave, Jane. So in the last talk, I gave you some headline ways in which geology and archaeology interact with each other. And what I would like to do very briefly to consider in a little bit more detail about the relationship between the physical artifacts and their geological source, and also to talk about stratigraphy and the relationship between geological and archaeological stratigraphy. So if I could have the next slide, please, Jane.
Oops, sorry.
So, thanks. So part of the reason for talking about the relationship between geology and archaeology is to, if you like, to tap into this mindful approach that Jane's talked about in terms of the digs. So in terms of giving you some of the ideas about the sorts of things from a geological point of view that it's worthwhile having in your minds when you're trying to interpret what's actually going on within the site. So one of the things, and particularly having SSD in your head and stone sorting and dispersal, is what is the relationship between the source and the manner of extraction from that source, the material which is then used to actually build. If I could have the next picture, please, Jane. In this particular case, a wall. So what are the sorts of things that we need to consider in order to be able to understand that relationship? So if we could have a look at the next picture, which gives an example which I managed to get into Tynemouth Priory over the weekend, which was absolutely fascinating and can highly recommend it. There's some really beautiful structures in there. And in particular, there are some really wonderfully weathered sandstones. And one of the things which you can see very immediately in this, the sort of things which is really useful to be able to observe are in terms of the sorts of patterns which you see within the stone, but also things around the size of the grains, the types of the grains, the angularity of the grain, and the relationship between the different sizes of the grain. And if we could have the next picture added to that, that then gives you clues about what the source of that material might be. I'll just wait for that one to come up. The next picture was actually taken in King Edward's Bay. So you can look out over the top of the priory and look down onto the beach there. You can actually see this stone on the beach there. And you can get an immediate flavour there that the two are probably related to each other in some way. However, it's only by going into the real detail around the grain size and the grain types and all those other pieces of information, you can actually be more certain about what that source is. And there's another example, if I could have the next slide, please. This is a location which some of you may recognise, which was a dig that was carried out a number of years ago. And I think, I'm hoping that everybody's getting these slides, but it's taking a while for them to come through at my end.
I've got them, Ian.
Great. Good, excellent. So I'm just going to keep on talking on the assumption that most people can see them. So the next picture is of the medieval, what's been interpreted as a medieval chapel on top of the Hugh on Lindisfarne, with these amazing big slabs, which you can see on the surface here. And if we look at the next picture, what you can see is that within those slabs, there are some distinct geological features. And in this particular case, interestingly, some ripple marks from some 350 million years ago, which helped diagnose this particular stone as coming from Carboniferous source, probably not on the island. Understanding these sorts of geological details are really important in terms of understanding what the source of material might be. Look at the next picture, please. And it's not only building material, but some of the more culturally significant items, and I'm not pretending to understand precisely what all these artifacts are, but from a geological point of view, there is a mixture of materials here. So bottom right, top left, you've got flint. And the top left is some sort of igneous material, really quite coarse grained, so plutonic. And the material on the bottom right is igneous again, but very fine grained and probably volcanic. And immediately by picking out those details about grain size, the interrelationship of the grain size, the texture and the surface of that, you're immediately learning something about the material. And in these cases, some of these items will have come from very, very significant distances, and they don't only tell you about source, but also about some of the process and the trade routes which were involved in actually moving these artifacts around. Look at the next slide, please. And also ceramics, which are almost inevitable. This, I have to admit, is one of my pieces of pottery, that in terms of understanding the source of this, that for me, the source of this was an online shop, so Pottery Crafts, based in Stoke-on-Trent. You could then trace that back outwards to the location of the clays which were used in order to produce the particular type of clay which are used for this pot, probably from locations down in different parts of Cornwall, some for the China clay, some for the Bull clay, which would have been admixed to produce this particular clay. The point being here that you can do exactly the same things with ceramic artifacts that you find on site as well, so that by having an understanding and good observation of what you can actually find within those ceramic materials, it tells you something about what the source of that material and some really useful archaeological information. So go to the next slide, please. So I think that's probably enough about artifacts. So what I would like to do now is talk briefly about stratigraphy. And it's been fascinating listening to Jane's description of archaeology and stratigraphy. And it's interesting that there is a need to understand both the vertical stratigraphy and the horizontal stratigraphy. And there are lots of parallels between the way that archaeologists understand stratigraphy and the way in which geologists understand it. So yes, for geologists, it's not just vertical sections, but also we need to understand the horizontal relationships between things. But for geologists, quite often what you're doing is using different locations in order to be able to tie together these broader horizontal relationships. And in the same way that geologists will be using, so here's a section just underneath Tynemouth Priory, where you can see there's a bottom unit which is distinctly different from the top unit. So the bottom unit is reddened and very blocky, whereas the top unit is much yellower, and it's got these very broad, fine-grained, angled striations going across it. So you can quite rapidly define broad units. And if you look more closely, you can see that there's another crushed, very red unit between those two, and then you can start to break out different units within that. So if you look in the bottom unit, you can see you've got some bulbous, slightly trough-shaped units interbedded with some finer grained material, and you can start to break down the stratigraphy in the same way. And a geologist would use very similar types of combinations of drawing and detailed observation in order to draw out and understand what it is that's actually going on here. In contrast to the archaeological interpretation of stratigraphic sequences, time is also important in the relationship of time. And again, in general, the bottom units will be the older ones, and as you go up the section, you'll be coming up through younger and younger units. But if you want to tie down the time more precisely, rather than using artifacts, geologists will be using fossils. And rather than using carbon dating, which we can use for tens and hundreds and thousands of years, we will be using things like potassium argon strontium, rubidium, neodymium, samarium, and lead isotope dating to give you the time periods of millions, tens and hundreds of millions of years in order to understand the age of these rocks. So why is that important in any sort of way? I thought it might be interesting to understand the relationship between geological and archaeological stratigraphy. But if we go to the next slide, that by understanding the geology that underpins a particular archaeological site, that is how we're going to start to understand the relationship between those parts of a landscape which are created through natural processes and those which are created through anthropogenic process, and the interaction between those two. So here's a rather wonderful site on Lindisfarne, which shows a cliff face which goes from quite distinct geological rocky material in very well defined layers, which as you progressively go up the cliff, you'll see gradually break down and turn into a crumbled mess, which as you go further up into the very top of the cliff, you'll see is very loose, unconsolidated material. And what we're going through here is a combination of hard rock geology, hard rock which has been broken up by a process of ice heave, so cycles of thawing and freezing, and then at the top we've got a pile of glacial material. And even above that you will then have a soil profile which is developed based on that glacial material and a biological layer. And if you like, that's the starting point for understanding what it is you're cutting into when you're actually looking at an archaeological dig. And if we could look at the next slide, please. And sometimes that interaction is really quite fascinating. And what I've got here is a cross-section through a layer where you've got at the bottom a sandy layer, and then at the top of, immediately above that, you've got what is labeled as a Tsunami Pop Deposit, where a really catastrophic geological event has happened, which has ripped up peat clasts, mixed it up with sand, and then dumped it all in a layer. And then another layer of peat has grown over the top of that, and then with the soil horizon over the top of this. And this is really quite interesting, particularly in the context of one of the digs which you can find on the coast around the Druridge Bay area, where you have a geological stratigraphy, which has then been dug into with anthropogenic intervention in the Iron Age, which has then been covered by a natural event in the shape of a tsunami, which is then followed by another sequence of peat and soil development or sand coverage in that particular excavation. So there is this interaction between geological and archaeological and anthropogenic stratigraphy, which I thought it would be interesting just to point out to give you something to contemplate when you're traveling away. And as a final slide, this is a very happy man who's got to the bottom of the archaeology and has discovered some very exciting geology, which I mentioned on the last dig. So a very thin layer of archaeology on top of some very hard specific geology. And you can just about see some holes in there, which are actually gas bubbles, which formed in the top of the windsill there on top of the Hoof, which gives some really fascinating geological information about the geology that you can find there. Great. Thank you, Jane. I'll stop there. I hope I've done less than the 15 minutes there.
That's great. Thanks, Ian.
You're welcome.
Can you all hear me again? Okay, so I talked about various ways of doing and recording stratigraphic excavation, which is taking the site apart in the reverse order to that which it was created in. So excavating the youngest first, going in reverse order. Stratigraphic excavation, trying to do that, is the best way of helping us to try and understand how it might have happened. And I mentioned that the unit of stratification, so the unit of our archaeological stratigraphy, is this thing called the context, which can be a layer, a deposit, a fill, a cut, with each of those numbers, those contexts representing an action or a group of actions that you can't separate, like creating a rubbish dump, for example. And in some cases you can. This particular midden or rubbish dump, you can see the different sorts of deposits that have gone into making it up. And that's why you can see in this section so many little white tags with context numbers on, which are the labels for the descriptions of all these different deposits in the section. And stratigraphy is how we read the sequence of context. Now, there was an archaeologist called Ed Harris who is working in very, very deep urban stratigraphy in Winchester quite some time ago now. And he wanted a tool that would help him to unravel the complicated relationships between the features that he was finding in this really deep and complicated layer upon layer through hundreds and hundreds of years of urban living. And his way of helping to understand that is a thing called a Harris matrix. And a Harris matrix is a diagrammatic expression of all the relationships on the site. And the great thing about it, and the reason why I'm introducing it to you, or you may already have met it, I'm sure many of you have, but the reason why I'd like us to try and chew on this is it's a brilliant way of making you think, making us think about how the site is put together. And it's based on the geological law of superposition, that if A covers B, B was deposited first, so B is older. So if context 1 overlies even partially context 2, then 2 is earlier. So that gives you an order of depositing, so that upper layers are younger and lower layers are older. Broadly, of course, there are exceptions, but we won't go into those tonight. And there are other laws that help us sort of untangle our stratigraphy. One is that archaeological layers which are not solid when they were deposited will tend to settle into a horizontal layer, and that if a layer isn't bounded by something originally, by a fence or a wall or something, it will tend to feather off down to a sort of thin edge. And so a vertical clean edge will need explaining. And then this law of succession, that a unit of archaeological stratigraphy takes its place in the sequence of stratigraphy from its position between the earliest of the units above it and the latest below it. That's sort of logical and commonsensical, but it's sometimes quite hard to apply it. Now, this is a Harris matrix. This is what Ed Harris, the sort of thing he was using, except with hundreds and hundreds of contexts to explain his urban stratigraphy. And you can see that each of these little rectangles represents one of those events, one of those contexts with its unique number, its labeling number inside. Now, context numbers are not values. All they are identifiers. So their numerical sequence has got nothing to do with the sequence of the events on site. So here you can see we've got bedrock, and we're looking at the south and north face of Hadrian's Wall. And so we've got the south face of the curtain wall built onto bedrock, and the north face built onto bedrock. We can't connect them directly because actually the two bits we were excavating were separated by the thickness of the wall. So we haven't got a direct physical relationship between the two faces themselves. And then above the wall, you've got subsoil mixed with backfill, one collapse, turf that's formed over it, a spoil heap, another collapse. And that's all happening on the south face. And on the north face, you've got two different sorts of collapses, earlier and later, but they're joined because both of them are covered by the turf and the topsoil that we took off. So that actually represents in a diagram what we were unpicking on site. And that's quite a straightforward one. They can be quite complicated. And here's just a diagram, a slide that explains how we put together the Harris matrix a bit more. And it's a way of showing what is on top of the context you're working on and what is underneath it. And this is chronologically, and what might cut So if someone's dug a post hole into the layer you're dealing with, and so what cuts the soil or what it is cut by. So you're getting that chronological sequence. And there are various relationships that you depict in your diagram. This is this context 1 overlies 2. So 1 is later than 2, and this is what they would look like in a section. 1 is the same as 2. Sometimes you can find out later on that 2 areas you were digging are actually the same thing. And here we've got a little Harris matrix, which is depicted in this little section drawing. You've got a layer 3, and you've got these 2 sort of dumps of material on top of them, which have no direct physical relationship. So what this says is these 2 don't have a direct physical relationship, but they're both later than the layer 3. And then they're all joined together by the latest, the earliest of the deposits, which is layer 4, which is on top of both 1 and 2, and so has a slightly different setup there. So that's the sort of basic relationships in a Harris matrix. And I'm sending you this exercise to do for next week, and with the sort of answers, as it were. So I'll just talk through this for 2 minutes and then I'll stop and you'll get these to think about. But the whole point of this is that it's all about understanding and thinking. And when you start to engage with this kind of thing and you start to really think about, okay, what has to have happened in order for this to be like it is when I'm digging it, you become a better digger. And it might sound a bit complicated, but actually it's a way of making your digging even more interesting. And I think everybody digs better when they dig with some understanding of how things are recorded and what you're trying to tease out of the thing you're working on. So what we've got here is natural subsoil. So this is a vertical section through a little pit or ditch, sorry. And the natural is given a context number 005. Then at some point, someone comes along and digs a ditch. So we're just looking at the profile of the ditch. It goes backwards and forwards in front of us. And the action of digging out that ditch is a negative action. It takes away material from the site, but it's got to have a shape. It's got to be described. So it has a context number. Then the ditch begins to silt up naturally, and that's given a number and described. And then it's filled up quickly by people who want to level the site in order to do something else. And then we've got a topsoil forming on top. And quite often you'll find in Harris matrices that positive contexts where things are added, like deposits and layers, will be in an oval, and the negative ones, the cuts where you're taking stuff away, will be in a rectangle. And what I ask you to do is to think about creating a Harris matrix for this section. And I'm giving you the answer to this one. And I'm giving you some other ones to think about, and also for you to try and think about what could have happened between the ditch filling up and this topsoil forming. And we'll talk about that as well in the seminar. Now, I'm going to stop there. You've had enough of me by now. But I want to stress that all this is not to kind of mystify the process, because actually it is very clear. Everybody can do it. I've worked with all sorts of people of all sorts of different levels of experience, and everyone can record to the highest standards and learn to dig better and better as they think more about what they're doing. And excavation is, to a certain extent, the essence of archaeology. It's this unrepeatable process that encompasses the thrill of discovery with meticulousness and the challenge of interpreting it. You're confronting the physicality of the past. It's manual and it's thoughtful. It's teamwork with care and imagination. And once you've made that decision that we talked about last time about where to dig, what you get from it depends on the quality of the sorts of things we've been talking about tonight. Okay, I will stop now. Okay, was there anything in the chat?